The letter did not arrive in an email. It arrived in a sealed envelope marked with a name James Carter had not spoken aloud in over 20 years. The words on the page felt unreal as he stood in the small rented apartment on the edge of Norfolk, Virginia, holding the document with hands that had survived more than a decade of military service but now trembled for reasons he could not explain. At 56 years old, James had learned to accept disappointment as a permanent part of life. Jobs came and went. Relationships faded. Opportunities dried up faster than they appeared. Yet nothing in his experience prepared him for what the lawyer's letter claimed. He and his dog had inherited an island. Not a house. Not a small property. An entire island off the Atlantic coast, registered under his grandfather's name, transferred legally upon death, with no prior warning, no explanation, and no apparent reason. Ranger, his German shepherd, lay quietly near the door, watching him with steady, intelligent eyes. The dog had always been calm in moments of tension, as if he understood things before they fully arrived. James lowered himself into a chair and read the document again. The island was listed under restricted access coordinates, approximately 23 nautical miles from the mainland, surrounded by navigational warnings and outdated maritime records. According to the paperwork, it had been privately owned for decades, though no public records showed development or habitation. It was as if the island existed in legal silence, acknowledged only by those who knew exactly where to look. James exhaled slowly, trying to connect the information to anything he knew about his grandfather. The man had been distant, private, almost myth-like in family memory. He spoke rarely, wrote even less, and disappeared from family gatherings long before James entered adulthood. When he died, there had been no funeral announcement that reached James directly, no final conversation, no closure. Only silence. Until now. Ranger stood and walked to the window, his posture shifting slightly. His ears lifted, his attention fixed on something outside that James could not see. "What is it?" James asked quietly, though he already knew the dog would not answer in words. Ranger turned back toward him, then toward the letter on the table, then back toward the door. A pattern of awareness. A signal of intent. The same behavior he showed before long journeys or unknown terrain. James frowned. "You think we are going somewhere," he said. The dog's tail moved once. Not excitement. Confirmation. That night, James could not sleep. The letter remained on the table, illuminated by a single lamp. Every few minutes, he reread the same line. Inheritance confirmed. Private island ownership transferred. Legal access granted to James Carter and designated companion. Companion. He glanced at Ranger. The word felt intentional, as if his grandfather had expected not just a person to arrive, but something else as well. Something living. Something capable of choosing paths without being told. By dawn, James had made a decision. He packed a single duffel bag, filled a small container with supplies, and placed Ranger's harness near the door. The dog approached immediately, calm and ready, as if he had been waiting for this moment longer than James had. Outside, the air was cold and damp with early coastal fog. A private ferry service listed in the documents awaited them at a small dock nearly an hour away. No one spoke during the drive. The world outside the windshield shifted from suburban edges to empty marshlands, then finally to the narrow stretch of coast where the ocean began to take over everything. When they arrived at the dock, the water was still, gray, endless. The ferry captain did not ask questions. He simply checked the coordinates, glanced once at Ranger, and nodded as if he had seen strangers with unusual destinations many times before. As the boat pulled away from shore, James stood at the railing, watching the mainland shrink into fog. Ranger stood beside him, unmoving, eyes locked forward. Somewhere beyond the horizon, beyond the charts and warnings, the island waited. And neither of them yet understood that inheritance was not the beginning of their story. It was the continuation of something that had already been in motion long before they arrived. The ferry cut through the gray Atlantic water with steady, unhurried motion, its engine the only sound breaking the endless stretch of ocean fog. James Carter stood near the railing with Ranger close beside him, both of them facing forward as if the horizon itself might eventually explain what words could not. The island was still invisible, hidden somewhere beyond the thick coastal mist, yet James already felt its presence in a way he could not logically explain. The farther they traveled, the more the world behind them seemed to disappear rather than shrink. No birds followed the boat. No other vessels crossed their path. It was as if the route had been cleared specifically for them, leaving only silence and open water. Ranger shifted slightly, his ears lifting again in the same alert pattern James had noticed the night before. The German shepherd did not appear anxious, but focused, as though tracking something just beyond human perception. James glanced down at him. "You sense it too, don't you?" he murmured. The dog did not respond, but his posture tightened. After nearly an hour at sea, the fog began to thin. At first it appeared as a darker shape against the horizon. Then slowly it formed into something solid. Land. The island emerged like a memory breaking through water. It was larger than James expected. Steep cliffs rose along its edges, covered in dense forest that appeared untouched by time. There were no visible buildings, no lights, no signs of modern life. Only raw land and stone, as if the island had been deliberately left alone for decades. The ferry captain reduced speed without speaking. He pointed toward a narrow inlet on the eastern side of the island where a small wooden dock barely held together by weathered beams extended into the water. "That is as far as I go," the captain said quietly. James nodded, though the man had already turned away. Ranger stepped forward first as the ferry aligned with the dock. The landing was rough, the wood creaking beneath their weight as they stepped onto the island. The moment James's boots touched the surface, a strange stillness settled around him. Even the ocean behind them seemed quieter, as if the island absorbed sound itself. The ferry pulled away without ceremony, leaving them alone. Completely alone. James turned slowly, taking in the shoreline. The dock led to a narrow dirt path that disappeared into thick vegetation. No signs, no markers, only trees and silence. Ranger stood at the edge of the path, sniffing the air carefully before taking the first step forward. James followed. The forest closed around them quickly. The canopy above filtered the sunlight into broken fragments that shifted across the ground as they walked. The deeper they went, the more the environment felt preserved rather than abandoned. Trees grew too evenly spaced. Stone markers appeared partially buried along the path, too deliberate to be natural. After several minutes of walking, Ranger stopped abruptly. His body stiffened. James froze immediately. Ahead of them, partially hidden behind vines and moss-covered stone, stood a structure. It was not large, but clearly built with intention. Weathered stone walls formed a circular foundation, and at its center stood a sealed iron door with no visible handle. Above it, carved into the stone archway, was a symbol James recognized instantly. The same mark from the legal documents. The same mark from the inheritance letter. The same mark that now seemed to belong entirely to this island. Ranger moved closer, nose low, tracing the edges of the structure with slow precision. Then he stopped directly in front of the iron door and sat down. Calm, certain, waiting. James approached slowly, heart tightening as he studied the entrance. The door showed no obvious mechanism, no lock, no external control, only the symbol. And beneath it, faint but visible under layers of age, a second inscription he had not noticed before. A single line of text carved into stone. What is hidden here was never meant to be owned alone. James stared at the words for a long moment, feeling something shift inside him. This was not a simple inheritance. It was an invitation, and Ranger, without hesitation, had already accepted it. James stood before the sealed iron door, his eyes tracing the ancient symbol carved above it while the forest around them remained unnaturally still. Ranger had not moved since sitting down. The German shepherd's posture was steady, focused, almost patient, as if waiting for a command that had not yet been spoken. James stepped closer and ran his fingers along the edge of the stone frame. The surface was cold despite the humid island air. There were no hinges visible, no handle, no mechanical lock. Only the symbol, repeated once more at the center of the door like a signature carved into history itself. He turned slightly, scanning the surrounding structure. The circular stone foundation suggested this was not a simple shelter or storage room. It had been built with purpose, precision, and permanence. Whatever lay beyond the door was not temporary. It had been intended to remain hidden for a very long time. Ranger suddenly stood. The movement was controlled, not alarmed. He approached the door again and placed his nose near the symbol. After a slow inhale, he stepped back and looked at James. That single glance carried more certainty than any sound or instruction. James exhaled slowly. "You want me to open it," he said quietly. The dog did not move, but his stillness confirmed everything. James looked around once more. The island remained silent, as though holding its breath with them. He pressed his palm against the stone above the symbol. At first nothing happened. Then, faintly, a deep mechanical sound echoed from within the structure. A low shift of weight, stone moving against stone, as if something ancient had recognized contact after years of waiting. James immediately pulled his hand back. Ranger stepped forward, ears raised, eyes locked on the door. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the iron surface began to respond. A seam appeared along the edges, barely visible at first. Then the entire door shifted inward with a heavy grinding sound that vibrated through the ground beneath their feet. Dust fell from the stone archway. The air that escaped from inside was different. Cooler. Older. Undisturbed. James tightened his grip on his flashlight as the opening widened just enough to reveal darkness beyond. No light. No movement. Only depth. Ranger entered first without hesitation. James followed closely behind, heart steady but alert. The moment they crossed the threshold, the sound of the outside world vanished completely. No wind. No birds. No ocean. Only silence, shaped by stone. The interior was a long corridor carved directly into the island's foundation. Walls lined with evenly spaced markings stretched forward into darkness. The same symbol appeared repeatedly along the path, growing more frequent the deeper they went. This was not random construction. It was a system, a controlled design. After several yards, faint light appeared ahead. Not artificial, not electrical. It was reflective, bouncing off polished stone surfaces deeper within the corridor. Ranger slowed slightly, but did not stop. His confidence remained unchanged. Finally, the passage opened into a large underground chamber. James stepped in and froze. The space was enormous, far larger than anything the island above could have suggested. Stone pillars supported a vaulted ceiling. Maps covered sections of the walls. Metal containers lined the perimeter. At the center stood a raised platform with a circular table engraved with coordinates, names, and layered markings that resembled both navigation charts and property boundaries. This was not a simple hidden room. It was an operational hub, a control center built beneath an entire island. James walked forward slowly, scanning every detail. Each map seemed to extend beyond the island itself, connecting to distant coastal regions and maritime routes. Ranger circled the platform once, then stopped near a set of stone steps leading deeper into the chamber. He looked back at James, then down the steps, then back again. An invitation without sound. James followed. The lower level was colder, more precise. On a stone pedestal rested a sealed container identical in design to the one James had seen in the earlier tunnels. But this one was larger, reinforced, marked with multiple layers of the same symbol. As James approached, he noticed something else. A faint recording device embedded into the stone beside it. The light flickered to life the moment he stepped within range. A voice began to play. Old, controlled, familiar. It was his grandfather. And the first words he spoke erased every assumption James had ever made about the inheritance. If you are hearing this, then the island has accepted you. Ranger sat beside the pedestal, perfectly still. James lowered the flashlight slightly, realizing that whatever legacy he thought he had inherited was not an end point. It was a continuation of something far larger than family, and far more deliberate than chance. The recording faded, leaving only the echo of the grandfather's voice lingering inside the underground chamber. James stood completely still, the weight of the words settling deeper with each passing second. If you are hearing this, then the island has accepted you. The sentence repeated in his mind like a locked loop he could not escape. Ranger remained seated beside the pedestal, calm and alert, as if the voice was not new to him at all. James slowly lowered himself to one knee, placing the flashlight on the stone floor. The beam tilted upward, revealing more of the chamber than he had processed at first glance. The walls were not just carved. They were organized. Every section corresponded to a specific region beyond the island, forming a layered network of mapped territories. Coordinates overlapped with handwritten annotations, suggesting decades of updates rather than a single design. This was not a hidden room. It was an evolving system, a living archive of control and observation. The recording device on the pedestal activated again without warning. The grandfather's voice returned, steadier this time, as if continuing a conversation long interrupted. Everything you see was never meant to belong to one person. It was built to outlast ownership. James glanced toward Ranger. The German shepherd stood now, staring directly at the sealed container. The same container that sat at the center of the platform, reinforced and layered with identical symbols etched into its surface. James approached it slowly. As he got closer, faint mechanical indicators became visible along its base. Not locks, not hinges, more like verification points. The system was waiting for something specific, something only the right presence could trigger. He hesitated. Why me? He whispered into the empty chamber, though he was not sure if the question was meant for the recording or for himself. The grandfather's voice responded as if it had anticipated the question. Because you were never chosen for wealth. You were chosen for restraint. The words struck harder than anything James had heard since arriving on the island. Ranger moved forward and placed a single paw on the stone step leading to the pedestal. The gesture was deliberate, controlled, final. The chamber responded. A low vibration spread through the floor beneath them. The sealed container emitted a soft mechanical tone, followed by a slow release of internal pressure. James stepped back instinctively as the outer casing of the container unlocked with a deep, resonant click. Dust rose gently into the air. The lid did not open fully. It shifted slightly, as if acknowledging presence before granting access. Inside, faint light began to glow. Not artificial illumination, but something embedded within reflective surfaces designed to activate only under specific conditions. Ranger did not move. His eyes remained fixed on the opening. James felt his breath slow. Every instinct told him he was standing at the threshold of something far greater than inheritance, property, or legal ownership. The grandfather's voice returned one final time, softer now, almost reflective. The island was never the secret. It was the lock. The recording ended. Silence returned instantly, heavier than before. James reached toward the container, but stopped just short of touching it. Because in that moment, he understood something he had not been prepared to accept. The island had not been waiting for him to arrive. It had been waiting to see if he would continue. James remained frozen in front of the partially opened container, the faint internal glow spilling across the stone pedestal like something alive trying to breathe after a long sleep. The chamber was completely silent now. Even the earlier mechanical echoes had faded, leaving only the sound of his own breathing and the steady presence of Ranger beside him. The German shepherd had not moved since the final words of the recording, yet his attention had intensified, locked entirely on the glowing interior, as if recognizing something deeper than sight. James finally stepped closer. Each movement felt measured, as though the air itself had grown heavier around the pedestal. The lid of the container had shifted just enough to reveal a layered interior structure, not filled with objects in the traditional sense, but with organized compartments arranged like a secured archive. Thin metallic frames held transparent panels, each etched with fine symbols and coordinate lines that mirrored the maps on the chamber walls. At the center of the structure was a compact cylindrical device embedded into a stone housing. It pulsed faintly with a rhythmic light, slow and steady, almost like a heartbeat. James reached out but stopped again, hesitating as a new realization formed. This was not treasure in the way people understood it. There were no visible riches, no immediate wealth. Instead, there was information, systems, control architecture, a design meant to outlast generations rather than enrich one. Ranger suddenly moved forward and placed his nose near the edge of the opening. He inhaled slowly, then stepped back, letting out a low, controlled breath. His behavior was not alertness this time. It was recognition. James frowned slightly. "You understand this better than I do," he said quietly. The words felt half-joke, half-truth. The grandfather's voice was gone, but its presence lingered in the structure itself. James carefully adjusted his position, leaning closer to examine the cylindrical device. As he did, faint projections activated across the inner chamber walls. Lines of light extended outward from the device, mapping invisible connections across the room, forming a network that resembled both navigation systems and legal boundaries. The island was not isolated. It was a node, a central point in a larger framework that extended far beyond its shores. James took a slow step back, overwhelmed not by fear, but by scale. Whoever his grandfather had been, he had not simply owned land. He had engineered control over something far larger than a single location. Ranger sat, again, calm and grounded, as if the revelation did not disturb him at all. James looked down at him. "This was why you brought me here, wasn't it?" he said softly. The dog did not respond, but his steady gaze remained fixed on the glowing system. The chamber's light began to stabilize, no longer flickering or pulsing, but holding a constant state of illumination as if the system had now fully acknowledged their presence. A final inscription appeared on the inner surface of the container, previously hidden until this moment. James leaned in to read it, his voice barely audible as he translated the engraved words. "To inherit the island is not to own it. It is to decide what it becomes." Silence returned immediately after. But this time, it felt different. Not empty. Waiting. And for the first time since arriving, James understood that leaving the island was no longer a simple option. Because whatever had been activated beneath their feet was now part of them as much as they were part of it. The chamber lights stabilized into a steady, low glow, revealing the full structure of what James now understood was not a simple sealed container, but a controlled system designed with layered intelligence. The cylindrical core at the center continued to pulse slowly, its rhythm unchanged, as if it had been waiting for a specific presence for a very long time. James stood motionless, absorbing the scale of what he was seeing. The maps, the symbols, the encoded pathways across the walls all connected into a unified structure that extended far beyond the room itself. It was not isolated engineering. It was coordination. Ranger remained seated near the pedestal, calm and unwavering. His eyes shifted occasionally between James and the glowing system, but his posture never changed. There was no hesitation in him, no confusion, only steady alignment with the environment, as if the island itself was familiar territory. James slowly walked along the edge of the chamber, studying the illuminated lines that projected from the core. They extended across stone surfaces and converged into distant points marked with precision. Each point corresponded to coastal zones, maritime paths, and restricted territories far beyond the island. This was not just a hidden facility. It was part of a wider operational framework. The realization settled in gradually, not as shock, but as accumulation. His grandfather had not simply built a private retreat or hidden storage system. He had created infrastructure that interacted with external systems, possibly without detection for decades. James stopped at one of the wall panels where coordinates were etched deeper than the rest. Beneath them were handwritten notes, faded but still legible. Words about protection, continuity, and controlled stewardship. Not ownership. Stewardship. Rangers suddenly stood again, moving toward a narrow passage at the far end of the chamber that James had not fully noticed before. It was partially concealed behind a stone partition, blending into the structure itself. The dog stopped at its entrance and looked back. This time, the signal was clear. James approached cautiously, feeling a shift in the atmosphere as they left the central chamber. The passage was tighter, more confined, with older markings on the walls that predated the system behind them. The deeper they moved, the more primitive the structure became, as if they were walking backward through time rather than forward through space. Eventually, the corridor opened into a smaller chamber. Unlike the previous room, this one contained no glowing systems or maps. Instead, it held a single stone pedestal with a sealed wooden case resting on top. The case was simple, worn, and completely unmarked except for a single carved phrase, "For the one who understands the burden." James approached slowly, his breathing measured. Ranger circled the pedestal once, then stopped beside it, sitting again as he had before every major discovery. James placed his hand on the wooden surface. It was not locked in the mechanical sense. There were no visible mechanisms or seals. Instead, it responded to touch alone, as if recognition was the only requirement. He opened it carefully. Inside were personal records, not financial documents, not maps, letters, photographs, and a handwritten journal bound in aged leather. The first photograph showed the island in its earliest form, untouched and raw, but in the background stood structures that matched the system they had just discovered. The journal opened to a marked page. James read the first line silently. If you are here, then you have already accepted that inheritance is not possession. It is responsibility shaped by time. He closed the journal slowly, feeling the weight of the message settle deeper than anything he had encountered so far. Ranger placed his head slightly forward, resting it near the edge of the pedestal, calm and steady. James looked at him, then at the journal, then back at the passage behind them leading to the larger chamber. For the first time since arriving on the island, he understood that nothing here had been hidden out of fear. It had been hidden out of design, and design always implied intention, which meant the island was not simply waiting to be discovered. It was waiting to be continued. James stood in the smaller chamber, holding the leather-bound journal, his fingers resting lightly on the worn cover, as if the material itself carried weight beyond its physical form. The words he had just read continued to echo in his mind, repeating the same idea in different forms. Inheritance as responsibility, not possession. Ranger remained close to the pedestal, calm and observant, his body angled slightly toward James rather than the corridor behind them, as though his focus had shifted entirely to his owner's reaction rather than the environment itself. James finally turned a page of the journal. The handwriting inside was precise, but aged, each line written with deliberate control. It described the island not as land, but as a system of continuity, a place designed to preserve decisions across generations, ensuring that no single individual could redirect its purpose without understanding the structure beneath it. There were references to agreements, maritime corridors, and legal frameworks that extended far beyond normal private ownership. The deeper James read, the more it became clear that his grandfather had not simply acquired the island. He had integrated it into something larger, something that required stewardship from whoever inherited it next. Ranger suddenly lifted his head and turned toward the corridor. The movement was subtle but immediate. James noticed it at the same moment, closing the journal slightly. A distant sound echoed through the stone passageway behind them. Not footsteps, not machinery, more like a structural shift, as if something within the island had responded to their presence. James stepped closer to the corridor entrance, listening. The sound did not repeat, but the silence that followed felt different. Pressurized. Intentional. As if the system they had activated was no longer dormant. Ranger moved forward first, positioning himself between James and the passage. It was not aggression. It was placement. A protective alignment that suggested awareness of change before confirmation. James lowered the journal back onto the pedestal and picked up the flashlight again. "We are not alone here," he said quietly, though there was no visible confirmation of his words. They returned together toward the main chamber. As they entered, the glowing network on the walls had shifted slightly. The lines that once appeared static were now subtly reconfigured, forming new intersections and updated pathways that had not been visible before. James stopped in the center of the room. "This was not active when we arrived," he said under his breath. Ranger circled once, then stopped facing the central core. The cylindrical device continued its steady pulse, but its rhythm had changed ever so slightly, like a system adjusting to input it had not fully anticipated. James approached the core carefully. The light within it intensified for a moment, then stabilized again. On the surrounding stone, new inscriptions appeared faintly, emerging from beneath layers of dust and time, as if freshly revealed by activation. Coordinates shifted, boundaries redefined. The island was not static. It was responsive. James realized then that everything they had uncovered so far was only the first layer of access. The real structure was still adjusting to their presence, evaluating them in real time. Ranger sat again, but this time his posture was different. Not relaxed, not exploratory. Waiting. James looked down at him. "You knew this would happen," he said quietly. The dog did not respond, but his steady gaze remained fixed on the core. A second sound echoed through the chamber, closer this time. The same structural vibration, but stronger, as if something deeper within the island had shifted position. James tightened his grip on the flashlight. The realization settled in slowly but firmly. The island was not just revealing its past. It was reacting to its new inheritors. And somewhere within its network of hidden systems, something else had just acknowledged their arrival. The vibration in the chamber did not fade this time. It continued in slow intervals, like a distant pulse moving through the island's underground structure. James stood still in the center of the main chamber, his flashlight beam steady, but now feeling smaller against the scale of the space around him. The illuminated network on the stone walls had changed again. New lines had formed, connecting previously separate points into tighter configurations. It was no longer just a map. It was a living system adjusting its own structure in response to their presence. Ranger remained seated near the central core, but his attention had shifted fully toward the far side of the chamber. James followed his gaze. Across the room, one of the stone panels that had previously been static was now subtly displaced. A narrow seam had opened along its edge, revealing a darker space beyond. James approached slowly. With each step, the air grew slightly cooler, as if the chamber was drawing breath from deeper within the island. He placed his hand near the edge of the panel. It responded with a faint mechanical resistance, then released with a soft internal click. The stone shifted inward. Behind it was a narrow passage, unlit and descending. This was not part of the original path they had taken. It had not been visible before the system activation. James hesitated. Ranger stood immediately, positioning himself at the entrance without hesitation. That simple movement removed any remaining uncertainty. They entered together. The passage sloped downward, tighter than the previous corridors, carved with less precision and more urgency, as if this section had been added after the main structure was completed. The walls here carried fewer symbols, but the ones that remained were larger, deeper, and more deliberate. James ran his fingers along the stone as they moved. It felt older, not abandoned, preserved. The descent ended at a second chamber, smaller but more concentrated in design. At its center stood a circular platform surrounded by concentric stone rings. Above it, suspended by reinforced supports, was a translucent panel displaying faint shifting patterns of light. Unlike the system above, this one was not stable. It fluctuated, reacted, adjusted continuously as if processing external conditions in real time. James stepped onto the platform cautiously. The moment he did, the light patterns shifted toward him. Ranger followed, and the display adjusted again. James looked around the chamber. "This is different," he said quietly. His voice felt absorbed by the space rather than reflected. On the far wall, an inscription became visible as the light stabilized briefly. It read, "Access is not granted by inheritance alone. It is granted by understanding continuity." James repeated the phrase under his breath. Continuity. The word carried more weight than he expected. It suggested that what they had found was not a static legacy, but an ongoing function. Something designed to continue operating beyond its creator. Ranger circled the platform once, then stopped at James's side. The dog's posture remained steady, but his attention was fully engaged with the shifting light above them. James looked up at the suspended display again. For the first time, he noticed subtle changes forming within it. Patterns were not random. They were responding to their position, their movement, and their presence within the chamber. It was mapping them, not as intruders, but as variables within the system. A low sound echoed through the structure again, deeper than before. Not mechanical, structural, as if something within the island had adjusted its internal balance once more. James felt a tightening in his chest, not from fear, but realization. "It knows we are here," he said. Ranger did not move. The chamber lights shifted one final time, stabilizing into a clear configuration. And in that moment, James understood the most important truth yet. The island was not just revealing secrets. It was integrating them. The chamber beneath the island continued to hum with a low, almost imperceptible vibration, as if the structure itself had begun breathing in response to their presence. James stood on the circular platform, his eyes fixed on the suspended, translucent panel above him. The shifting light patterns no longer felt random. They were structured, deliberate, and increasingly synchronized with their movements. Ranger remained close, positioned slightly behind James now, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, as though guarding the boundary between the unknown system and the man trying to understand it. James slowly stepped off the platform, and immediately the light pattern above shifted again, recalibrating in real time. He paused, then stepped back onto it. The response repeated instantly. "It is tracking us," James said quietly, more to himself than to Ranger. The dog did not react outwardly, but his attention remained locked on the floating display. James moved slowly across the platform in a controlled arc. The light responded to each step, adjusting its geometry, redrawing its internal structure like a living model of decision-making. This was not passive observation. It was active analysis. The system was learning them. A faint tone echoed through the chamber, different from the previous structural sounds. This one was sharper, more precise, almost like a confirmation signal. On the far wall, additional markings began to appear, emerging from beneath the stone surface. They were not carved. They were illuminated from within the material itself, revealing text that had been dormant until this exact moment. James approached the wall cautiously and read the emerging inscription. Primary inheritance condition active. Secondary inheritance layer initiating. He stepped back slightly. The wording was not metaphorical. It was procedural. Ranger moved toward the center of the platform and sat directly beneath the suspended panel. As soon as he did, the light pattern shifted again, this time aligning around him instead of James. James noticed the change immediately. "Why is it reacting to you?" he murmured. The dog remained still, his gaze steady and forward-facing. There was no tension in him, only alignment. The chamber responded again. A deeper vibration passed through the stone beneath their feet, stronger than before. The circular rings surrounding the platform began to rotate slowly, not physically, but through projected light patterns that created the illusion of motion. James felt the structure beneath him recalibrating once more, as if the entire island system was reorganizing based on multiple inputs. His presence, Ranger's presence, and something else, something unspoken. The suspended panel above them suddenly expanded its projection outward, filling more of the chamber with layered data streams. James stepped closer to the center, scanning the shifting patterns. Coordinates, legal frameworks, and environmental overlays merged into a single evolving structure. But at the core of it all, one sequence repeated continuously. Not a location, not a value, a directive. Continuity requires dual confirmation. James froze. Dual confirmation, he repeated slowly. He looked down at Ranger. The dog looked back. For a moment, the entire chamber seemed to quiet, as if waiting for recognition of what that phrase truly implied. James exhaled slowly, the realization forming with uncomfortable clarity. The island was not transferring ownership to a single heir. It was requiring partnership, a decision that could not be made alone. The system above them dimmed slightly, then stabilized once again, holding its structure in a steady state of anticipation. James placed one hand on the edge of the platform and looked around the chamber. "He built this for both of us," he said quietly. Ranger stood and stepped forward until he stood directly beside James. The chamber responded immediately, the light pattern merging around both of them into a unified configuration. And for the first time since arriving on the island, James understood that inheritance was not a destination. It was a test of balance between two presences that the system had been waiting to recognize all along. The chamber settled into a deep, synchronized hum after James and Ranger stood side by side on the platform. The light structure above them no longer shifted chaotically or in response to isolated movement. Instead, it stabilized into a unified pattern that surrounded both of them equally, as if the system had finally accepted a complete configuration. James remained still, absorbing the significance of what had just occurred. Ranger stood calmly at his side, neither tense nor passive, but fully present within the system's response field. The realization from moments earlier continued to echo in James's mind. Dual confirmation, not inheritance by one, but activation by two. The chamber's projection expanded outward again, but this time it did not scan or analyze. It revealed. Lines of light extended across the walls and converged into a single central projection that hovered above the platform. The data streams reorganized into a structured document format, layered with coordinates, historical logs, and operational directives. James stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he recognized patterns within the information. This was no longer just mapping. It was governance architecture. Beneath the coordinates were references to legal transfers, environmental control zones, and maritime jurisdiction overlays that extended far beyond the island itself. The system was not isolated. It was integrated into a larger framework that spanned external territories. James exhaled slowly. This was never just an island, he said quietly. Ranger remained focused on the projection, his head slightly tilted, as if tracking subtle changes in the display. A new sequence activated above them. The central projection split into two aligned columns, each labeled with identical identifiers. One column responded to James's presence. The other responded to Ranger's proximity. The system was clearly distinguishing between them, while simultaneously requiring both inputs to remain active. James reached out cautiously and placed his hand near the edge of the platform. The projection reacted instantly, expanding its data field across the chamber once more. But when he removed his hand, the system did not collapse. It simply shifted emphasis to Ranger's position, maintaining stability through dual presence rather than singular input. James looked down at the dog. "It is built around both of us," he said again, this time with more certainty. Ranger stood and moved slightly forward until he was directly beneath the central projection. The light adjusted immediately, aligning perfectly above him. James noticed something new forming within the data stream, a final layer that had not appeared before. A directive sequence marked with repeated references to stewardship continuity, long-term preservation protocols, and decision authorization thresholds. At the bottom of the sequence was a single requirement: cooperative authorization required for full activation. James stepped back slightly. The meaning was no longer abstract. The system was not designed to be controlled individually. It required agreement, balance, mutual acknowledgement between human and companion. Ranger turned his head and looked at James directly. The chamber remained silent, awaiting response. James felt the weight of the decision settle fully for the first time. This was not just inheritance. It was shared responsibility encoded into structure, law, and environment itself. He slowly nodded, more to himself than to the system. "Then we do it together," he said quietly. At that moment, the entire chamber responded. The projection stabilized into a complete configuration, lights aligning across every surface in perfect symmetry. The island system had not merely accepted them, it had activated through them. And somewhere deeper within its hidden network, something long dormant transitioned from standby into full operational awareness. The chamber remained in a fully stabilized state after James's decision, the synchronized light structure holding steady across every surface like a completed equation finally resolved. James stood motionless on the platform, his hand still slightly raised from the moment of acknowledgement, as if the system had recorded not just his choice but the intent behind it. Ranger stood beside him, calm and centered, his presence no longer acting as a trigger or variable, but as an equal anchor within the system's configuration. The projection above them shifted once more, but this time without instability or recalibration. It expanded smoothly, revealing a broader interface that extended beyond the chamber's physical limits. Lines of light stretched outward through invisible layers, mapping connections that no longer felt confined to the island alone. James slowly looked upward, realizing that what he was seeing was not a local system response, but a wider network activation sequence. The island was communicating outward. Data streams flowed across the chamber walls in structured waves, forming recognizable segments of maritime routes, territorial boundaries, and encrypted identifiers that extended into global coordinates. James took a step forward. "It is linking outward," he said quietly. Ranger remained still, his attention fixed on the central axis of the projection where all data converged. A new sequence appeared, brighter than the rest. It pulsed at regular intervals, as if awaiting synchronization confirmation. The chamber responded to James and Ranger simultaneously, requiring both presence points to remain active for continuity. James moved slightly to the left, and the projection adjusted. Ranger shifted a step forward, and the system recalibrated again without delay. It was no longer testing. It was integrating. The stone beneath them emitted a deep, low resonance that traveled through the entire structure. Unlike previous vibrations, this one carried a directional quality, as if energy was being transmitted rather than released. James felt it through his feet, steady but persistent. The island was no longer dormant. It was online. On the far wall, a previously unseen interface emerged from beneath the stone surface, revealing a layered structure of permissions and operational hierarchies. James approached it carefully, reading the newly visible text. Global Continuity Protocol engaged. He paused. The phrase carried implications far beyond inheritance or ownership. This was infrastructure, systems, long-term control, mechanisms designed to persist beyond individual lifespans. Ranger moved closer to James, stopping at his side again. The chamber responded instantly, stabilizing all projections into a unified grid pattern that surrounded them completely. For a brief moment, everything aligned perfectly. James exhaled slowly. This was never about land, he said. It was about continuity of something larger. The system responded with a soft tonal confirmation, almost imperceptible, but present enough to confirm acknowledgement. The projection above them shifted again, this time revealing a new segment labeled External Dependency Layer. James studied it closely. The island was not isolated. It was interconnected with external frameworks that operated independently of visible governance structures. Financial, environmental, and maritime systems all appeared interconnected through encrypted pathways originating from this location. Ranger suddenly tilted his head slightly, focusing on a section of the projection that had not yet stabilized. James followed his gaze. Within the unstable segment, a faint disruption appeared. Not an error, a divergence. Something or someone else was interacting with the system from outside their current control field. The chamber's lighting dimmed slightly in response. James felt a shift in atmosphere immediately. "We are not the only ones who know it is active," he said quietly. Ranger stood firmly, his posture unchanged, but fully alert now. The system above them paused its expansion, holding in a suspended state, as if waiting for confirmation of how to proceed. James stepped forward once more, placing himself directly beneath the central projection. Ranger followed, aligning beside him without hesitation. Together, they formed the required configuration once again. The chamber stabilized. But this time, it did not feel like completion. It felt like recognition from something much larger that had finally turned its attention toward them. The system entered a sustained state of full activation, and the chamber beneath the island no longer behaved like a hidden structure, but like an integrated command node responding to external pressure. James stood beneath the central projection with Ranger aligned at his side, both of them maintaining the required configuration that kept the system stable. The layered grid of light above them expanded again, but this time it did not simply reveal data. It began filtering incoming signals. James noticed it immediately. The patterns were no longer purely internal. External coordinates were being processed in real time, and something outside the island's system was actively probing its structure. A faint distortion appeared within the projection field, like a ripple passing through a perfectly still surface. Ranger shifted his stance slightly, his focus tightening on the unstable region. James followed his gaze. "It is not just monitoring anymore," James said quietly. "It is responding." The chamber's lighting dimmed for a moment, then stabilized as the system compensated for the interference. New layers of encrypted structure unfolded above them, revealing protective overlays that had not been visible before activation. These overlays formed a defensive architecture, suggesting the system had safeguards designed specifically for external contact. James moved a half step forward, studying the incoming pattern. It was not random interference. It was structured inquiry. Someone or something was attempting to access the same system they had just activated. Ranger suddenly looked toward the far edge of the chamber where a secondary interface had begun to flicker. It had not been active before. James turned quickly. The interface resolved into a narrow column of data streams, pulsing with irregular timing. It was different from everything else in the chamber. Less stable, less controlled, more aggressive in its frequency. James approached cautiously. The system reacted immediately, projecting a warning sequence across the stone floor beneath his feet. External intrusion detected. The display read in fragmented layers of light. James stopped. The chamber responded by increasing its internal synchronization with Ranger's position, reinforcing stability through their combined presence. "Someone else is trying to access this," James said. Ranger remained still, but his attention never left the unstable interface. The projection above them shifted again, now displaying a comparison sequence between internal island systems and external request patterns. The disparity was clear. Whoever was attempting access did not possess full authorization, but they were close enough to trigger partial system acknowledgement. James exhaled slowly. "It is not random," he said. "It is targeted." The chamber responded with another deep, low vibration that traveled through the structure. This time, the sound carried urgency. Not panic, but priority escalation. The island system was adjusting its operational state to accommodate a potential breach scenario. Ranger stepped slightly forward, positioning himself between James and the unstable interface. The projection immediately stabilized around them again, confirming dual presence as the primary control anchor. James looked down at him. "You think this is why we were brought here?" he said quietly. Ranger did not move, but his posture confirmed awareness of escalation. The chamber's lighting shifted once more, and a new layer of encrypted structure appeared at the top of the projection field. This one carried a designation that had not been visible before. Inheritance Continuity Defense Layer. James read the words slowly. The meaning was immediate. This system was not only designed to be activated, it was designed to be defended. And now, for the first time since arriving on the island, James understood that their presence had not only awakened the system, it had also alerted something beyond it that the system itself was prepared to resist. The chamber beneath the island had fully transitioned into a defensive operational state, and every layer of light and structure now carried the tension of active monitoring. James stood beneath the central projection with Ranger firmly beside him, both of them locked into the system's required dual presence configuration. The atmosphere was no longer purely investigative. It was anticipatory, as if the island itself was waiting for a decision point to resolve external pressure. The projection above them continued to fluctuate between internal mapping and external intrusion tracking. James could see it clearly now. The system was not simply reacting to their activation. It was balancing them against something outside the island's perimeter. Ranger shifted slightly, his stance steady but more anchored, as though he understood that remaining in position was now critical to system stability. James followed the shifting data streams as they converged into a single point of focus. The external signal that had been detected earlier was no longer distant. It had strengthened. The chamber responded immediately with layered countermeasures, and a new structural field appeared around them, forming a dome-like containment pattern of light and encoded geometry. James took a slow breath. "It is isolating us," he said quietly. Ranger did not move. The projection responded to his voice with a brief recalibration, confirming that verbal input was now part of the system's acknowledgement structure. The chamber's stone floor vibrated again, but this time the resonance was controlled, structured, and directional. The island system was actively shielding itself. James stepped slightly closer to the center of the platform, and the projection expanded once more. New data layers appeared, labeled as External Persistence Resistance Protocol. The wording suggested that the system had anticipated interference long before their arrival. Ranger suddenly turned his head toward the same unstable interface James had observed earlier. It flickered again, more aggressively now, as if attempting to force synchronization with the island system. James approached the edge of the platform, studying the conflict between internal stability and external pressure. "It is not trying to break in," he said slowly. "It is trying to match it." The chamber responded with a deep harmonic pulse, acknowledging the observation. The system adjusted its configuration, reinforcing the dual anchor structure around James and Ranger. The entire chamber now functioned like a controlled interface node under stress, maintaining balance through their combined presence. A new sequence emerged in the projection. This one was different. It did not map territory or systems. It displayed a procedural hierarchy. At the top was a designation James had not seen before: Legacy Continuity Override Authorization. Beneath it were two input fields, both marked as required. One aligned with human presence, the other aligned with nonverbal behavioral input. James looked at Ranger. "It is still waiting for us to finalize it," he said quietly. Ranger met his gaze briefly, then returned his focus to the central projection. The chamber's lights stabilized again, but only partially. The external interference remained present, though contained. The system was holding, but under sustained evaluation pressure. James stepped forward and placed his hand near the central interface zone. The projection reacted immediately, expanding outward in response. Ranger moved simultaneously, maintaining alignment without hesitation. The system registered both inputs and locked into a stable configuration. For a moment, everything paused. The chamber, the island network, and the external intrusion all reached a temporary equilibrium point. Then the projection displayed a final message across the stone surfaces. Continuity confirmed. Defense integrity maintained. Awaiting next directive cycle. James lowered his hand slowly, realizing that what they had just completed was not the end of activation. It was the beginning of governance. Ranger remained still at his side, both of them now fully integrated into a system that extended far beyond the island itself. And somewhere beyond the horizon, something that had attempted access remained present, waiting, no longer ignored by the island's defenses.